Language, the principal method of human communication, consisting of words used in a structured and conventional way and conveyed by speech, writing, or gesture. Or that is, according to the Google search at least. Essentially, it's what we use to broadcast our ideas with each other, to chat with friends and family, learn new things at school, and express rampant feelings in social media comment sections. But there are more languages than just English. There's French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, Arabic, Hindi, Mandarin, Bengali, Japanese. Ooh, Japanese. Now, if a monolinguist sixth former, like myself, wanted to go about learning an entirely different language from scratch, how would he go about it? This is a collection of findings as to what extent I could learn a language within 6 months, an exploration into second language acquisition. Over a span of 180 days, I spent my days and nights attempting to learn a language. I drew advice from relevant theories of language acquisition and integrated them into my own style of learning, in which I will explain throughout the duration of this video. The choice for which language to learn wasn't a hard one. Being an adamant fan of its music, media and culture, I'd always wanted to learn Japanese, and this is the perfect opportunity to do so. It was a language that I would make everyday use of and I had a desire to pursue. However, it didn't seem as though it was going to be an easy task, as the FSI rated Japanese as one of the hardest languages for an English speaker to learn. The initial criteria for this project were as follows: to learn as much Japanese as possible in 6 months, to achieve a spoken vocabulary of 3,000 high-frequency words, to achieve a conversational level of fluency, to hold a conversation in Japanese by the end of 6 months, and finally, to evaluate my acquisition as well as factors affecting my progress. Day 1. Japanese has a completely alien alphabet to English. In fact, it has 2 of them. I spent the first 7 days of my acquisition by learning the alphabets hiragana and katakana. It's what the first couple of pages of the Genki 1 textbook focus on, and were essential if I were to learn Japanese. I split the alphabets into sets and learned each of them one by one. This is due to an article by Chris Benderev which advises one not to remember too many things at once, as it might lead to one forgetting the knowledge they are trying to memorize. I started with the vowels, then the Ks, the Ss, the Ts, all the way down to N. This also included the characters with diacritical marks. For example, if you take the Ks and you add diacritical marks onto them, they become Gs. By the end of day 7, I was easily able to read and write both hiragana and katakana. Day 8 is when I began working through a textbook, as well as starting to learn actual vocabulary. I chose to study the Genki textbooks as they focus mainly on grammar, which, according to studies, adolescents are the most efficient at acquiring. Initially, I had to complete both textbooks and learn 3,000 words by the end of 6 months. From this point onwards, I was completing 4 textbook pages and learning 17 new words a day. The rather bold vocabulary target of 3,000 words was due to multiple reasons. Firstly, the word count needed to be high if I were to achieve a conversational level of fluency. And secondly, Japanese has a higher level of precision compared to English in terms of such things as formality and pronouns. I made sure to pick and choose only the core vocabulary as suggested by multiple linguists. I started off with basic vocabulary and grammar, learning the subject-object-verb sentence structure of Japanese, which is different to English's subject-verb-object sentence structure. I also learnt simple phrases such as "Ima nanji desu ka?" What time is it? And "Senmon wa Nihongo desu?" My major is Japanese. By day 16, I had managed to acquire some toolbox questions, if you will, as suggested by Chris Lonsdale. Questions such as "Kore wa nan desu ka?" What is this? And "Kore wa Nihongo de toimasu ka?" How do you say this in Japanese? These questions would surely help me through early speaking in Japanese. The problem was, I didn't have much of a chance to partake in any speaking. And this was mainly due to the fact that I happened to be undertaking this project during a global pandemic, which meant I was restricted as to where I could go and who I could meet. According to Long's theory of interaction, this may have hindered my progress, as the theory states that participation in conversation with native speakers is the necessary and sufficient condition for second language acquisition. By day 20, I had learnt about particles, which allowed me to connect ideas to make longer sentences. For example, the particle de I could use to indicate where something took place, and the particle ni I could use to indicate where I was going or when an event happened. By day 24, I was able to describe the location of objects using prepositions such as migi, right, hidari, left, and naka, inside. By day 34, I had learnt the essential te form of a verb. Paul Pimsleur says that all languages have devices for conveying whether an action is presently going on or is finished. The te form is exactly that device in Japanese. Now, I was able to describe sentences that described actions in progress, as well as sentences describing multiple actions at once. An example sentence could be, "Kyou wa 6 ji ni okite benkyou shite imasu." Today, I got up at 6 and I'm studying. By day 44, I had learnt to use short forms, which are a conjugation of verbs to be used in casual conversation. It was here that the point about Japanese having a higher level of precision became prevalent. In Japanese, one uses different variants of verbs to show respect to the status of the person they are talking to. This became more evident when I went on to learn honorific and extra modest verbs. It was also around this point that I decided to start observing Japanese media in order to A. have multiple exposures to the language, and B. become acquainted with the rhythms and patterns of Japanese. Now, I had already been watching anime regularly and listening to Japanese music, watching shows such as One Piece or Attack on Titan, but I'd never actually tried to understand any of what the characters were saying. Yet, I found that when I actively tried to decode the sentences I was hearing, it brought me great joy to be able to translate just a word or two per sentence, as it was self-proof that I was progressing. And as Chris Lonsdale suggests, I was tolerant of ambiguity. I didn't become frustrated not being able to understand every word or sentence, but instead relishing the few times that I could faintly make out a translation. Day 60 was when I'd finished all the grammar in the Genki 1 textbook, yet I didn't feel as though I was progressing as much as I'd wanted to. Trying to learn multiple grammar devices, as well as 17 new words a day, became taxing on my mind, and I wasn't retaining the knowledge well enough. I did some research and found out that this was because the process of memory consolidation takes longer in adult humans. My brain was simply unable to keep up with itself in trying to memorize all these new words. And this is where I made a significant change that would greatly affect the outcome of this project. Instead of learning 3,000 words, I decided I would focus on learning the 1,500 I had already come across, in order to effectively integrate them into my Japanese vocabulary. By doing this, I decreased my chances of achieving a desired conversational level of fluency, but had allowed myself to go on to fully understand what I'd already learned. For the next few weeks, I decided that I would revise the kanji and grammar devices of Genki 1 to fully consolidate my knowledge before moving on to Genki 2. As stated, I spent the next 3 or so weeks revising the grammar I had learnt. I also learned the 145 kanji in the first textbook, with flashcards on the app Quizlet. If these kanji were to be fixed in my mind, I needed to overlearn them through the rigorous process of drilling. On day 70, I thought I'd try something new. In order to fully evaluate my acquisition, I needed more evidence. I decided I would record videos of myself and analyse them. I would speak through the process of retelling, recommended again by Dr. Fiona McPherson. I would think of random sentences using words and grammar devices I had learned, and then try to apply them through random speech. Ohayo, watashi no mae wa Alex desu. 私は17歳です。私の誕生日9月の8日です。家人とイランド人です。日本語は教します。高校生6年です。日本語は長くて難しいですか？でも楽しいです。Now this was a very rocky start to my Japanese speaking, with incorrect placements of particles, slow speaking, and incorrect grammar. Clearly after 2 months I hadn't progressed as much as I would have liked to. For example, let's go back to when I said Nihongo o shimasu. In the subtitles it supposedly says I'm doing Japanese, whereas in reality what I was really saying was I speak Japanese. Clearly at this stage I didn't. While still in the process of revising grammar, I decided I would record another video 2 weeks later, on day 84. 私は3ヶ月の日本語を勉強します。日本語は難しいです。でも、日本語勉強が楽しくなりました。日本語の方がスペイン語より楽しいです。間違いない。参戦後やり方だが時間がないので参戦後は難しすぎます。 今、私は1500語をします。日本に行きたいことがありません。だが、いつか日本を行きたいです。By the second video, I had improved greatly since the first time. I used multiple grammar devices, short forms of verbs, and even the past tense. Yet the speed of my speech, while it had increased slightly, was still slow and sluggish. Yet this time I did something different. As well as recording a spoken video, I also tested myself in kanji recognition as well as writing. I did this as a form of effective learning, as I was able to monitor and review my methods with these mini assessments. I was quite pleased with myself after the first assessment. I'd been able to recognise 97% of the kanji I'd learnt up to that point, as well as use 19 unique kanji in my writing. Day 86, I began working through the second Genki textbook. I did relatively the same as to what I did between days 8 and 60, except this time I made sure that I took steps to help me consolidate the knowledge I would learn. When learning new grammar devices, I would try to retell them in my own sentences, written as well as orally. I was also still trying to reach the target of 1,500 words. Similarly to how I learnt kanji, I used flashcards on the Quizlet app to drill them into my mind. By day 88, I had completed the first chapter of the second textbook. I decided that I would learn the kanji for that specific chapter instead of waiting till I had finished all the grammar to learn the entirety of the book's kanji. This is like when I was learning the alphabet. I split the kanji learning for book 2 into sets to make them easier to digest. Thankfully, the book had lists for the kanji used in each chapter, so from there, it was just a case of me learning them. Day 92, I learned how to say I give. There are 3 separate verbs for the action of giving. There's ageru, used when you yourself give to others, kureru, used for when someone gives something to someone else, and finally, morao, which is used for when someone is receiving something. It was here that it became clear to me the higher level of precision in Japanese, as I found it somewhat difficult to formulate sentences describing the action of giving using the correct verb. At this point, I was around halfway through my acquisition, and I felt as though it was going relatively well. On day 98, I recorded my third video. 子供の時、愛者をしてが欲しいでした。今、私は弁護士をしてが欲しいです。なぜ？人を助けてが好きです。私は話してのが上手です。ずっとボリボールをやってみたいと思っていました。しかし、子供の時、私はいいじゃありませんでした。とにかく、弁護士の方がボリボール選手より裕福です。By day 98, there was clearly an increase in the speed of speech, although this was greatly due to the help of a script. Nevertheless, I was speaking more content and with greater complexity, integrating even more grammar devices such as gahoshi, I want, jozu desu, I am good at, and hogai is better than. Yet, I was still making mistakes. Instead of saying bengoshi o shite ga hoshi desu, I want to do a lawyer job, I should have said bengoshi ni naritai, I want to become a lawyer. Furthermore, I didn't sound like I was Japanese. My accent and rhythm were not anything close to native-like. This is when I decided to increase my intake of Japanese media, to listen to the rhythms of Japanese as Chris Lonsdale suggested. It was at this point where I completely stopped listening to English music and listened only to Japanese songs. Days 99 to 111. These days were simply just carrying on with general study. On day 110, I learnt the grammar device mitai desu, it looks like, and could now make comparisons and give further descriptions to objects and people. This device allowed me to add further complexity to the process of retelling. For example, if I saw a ball, I could say something like, Kore wa boru desu, this is a ball. But with the mitai device, I can now add to that statement and say something like, Kono boru ga ringo mitai desu, this ball looks like an apple. On day 112, I recorded my 4th video. もしもし、これは4ヶ月日本語を勉強して、どうですか？いいです、いいです、楽しいだ。1時間半、毎晩をします。時々少ない、時々多い。私は読書が得意です。この日本の短編小説を読んでいます。難しいので嫌いです。聞くの下手だ。しかし、たくさんアニメを見てる。練習だ。書き込み が好きじゃありません。漢字を知らない。たくさん話したい。でも、高いです。じゃあ、さよなら。Compared to the last video, I was speaking much more casually and confidently. This is because after watching a TED talk by Benny Lewis, I realised that when speaking, I shouldn't have been trying to focus too much on the use of complicated grammar, but rather just speaking as a means of communication. As Benny Lewis suggests, I had to embrace my mistakes and be comfortable with the incorrect grammar, just as long as I conveyed my ideas successfully. On day 113, I learnt about transitivity pairs. In Japanese, as well as English, there are transitive verbs, verbs that accept one or more objects, and intransitive verbs, verbs that do not allow a direct object. For example, compare these two sentences. The first sentence, Takeshi-san ga denki o tsukemasu, includes the subject, Takeshi-san, the object, denkyu, and uses the transitive verb tsukeru. Whereas in the second sentence, denkyu o tsukimashita, only the object is given, and the intransitive verb tsuku is used. Learning transitivity pairs greatly helped to improve my retelling ability, as I could now speak in more precise sentences. Days 121 to 126. This is the point at which I'd come across honorific, extra modest, and humble expressions, which added a further level of complexity to Japanese verbs. In many cases, such as the honorific verbs, I had to learn completely new words to speak highly of a person performing a certain action. For example, the sentence kari wa itta translates to he said, he being a random person that you may or may not know. Yet, if one were to talk about, say, their boss, someone of higher status than them, they would say something like kari wa osharimashita, which translates to something along the lines of he, brackets graciously said. Again, Hoyt's point about the higher level of precision in Japanese was clear here. If I were to achieve any level of fluency, I needed to learn to use these forms of verbs to be versatile in conversation with different kinds of people. I also recorded my 5th video on day 126. これは約4ヶ月半日本語を勉強します。早く始めればよかったです。バカみたいだ。日本語を話したい。しかし時間がない。僕が学校に行く。僕が数学を勉強。僕は寝る。実は日本語を知らない。まあね。いつも音楽を聴きながら日本語を勉強します。日本の音楽が大好きです。とっても良いです。例えば、よろしかとかな分。音楽を聴くと私は幸せです。いつも日本語に行こうと思っています。絶対に行きます。By the 5th video, I was beginning to see some improvement. I'd stuck to the mindset of focusing mainly on communicating my ideas, but was also effectively integrating grammar devices. Though there was a misinterpreted sentence where I said, I always study Japanese while listening to music, where I was meant to say it the other way around, but errors like that were expected. The main point is that I was becoming more comfortable with general speaking. I had also managed to remember 39 more kanji since the prior test, yet I had incorporated less kanji into my writing. This is because when speaking and writing, I was only using vocabulary in kanji that I already knew. While I may have been endlessly practicing flashcards, it didn't seem as though my vocabulary was necessarily improving. When learning new vocabulary, I was simply just recognizing the words and just repeating this process of stimulus and response. But as Pimsleur quotes, to merely repeat without recreating the situation is almost completely useless. The problem was that I was not actively trying to reproduce vocabulary, which led me to gradually forgetting words over time. To combat this, Pimsleur suggests his program of graduated interval recall. Mark Manson also suggests a similar thing. The method supposedly helped with word retention. It was to recall a word and its meaning, then recall the same word after intervals, each interval increasing after the next. Pimsleur claims that if you program your study correctly, then every time you revive an item, you make it harder to forget. I decided that I would put this to the test. So what I'm going to test out now is Pimsleur's method of graduated interval recall. And this is essentially where you take a word and you recall it and recall it and recall it, but each time you do so there is an increasing interval. And hopefully this helps with word retention, which is something that I'm currently struggling with. So I'm going to put it to the test. I have part of my word bank, and I'm going to take a word that I'm not too familiar with. Okay, let's take shimekiri, which means deadline, and the kanji looks like this. Okay, that's what the kanji looks like. So the method is that I'm going to start a stop clock and pen at the ready. I'm going to try and recall the word and the kanji at regular intervals up to 2 minutes, increasing intervals up to 2 minutes, so 3 seconds, 9 seconds, 27 seconds, and then finally 120 seconds. And then finally, to test if it's truly effective, I'm going to wait an hour and then see if I can recall it from there. Okay, so let's start the clock. So coming up to 3 seconds, shimekiri means deadline. And then coming up to 9 seconds again, shimekiri, and it means deadline. Let's see if I can write the kanji for that real quick. I'm going to write that quite fast actually. That's my 9 seconds, and then 27 seconds. I've just rubbed it out. Will I remember it again? That's my result of 27 seconds. Okay, now I'll wait till the 2 minute mark. Right, we're coming back up to 2 minutes. The word is shimekiri. It means deadline. And right, I think I went with the Russia's kanji.
Yeah. If I can remember my mistakes. Yeah. Right.
That's what my version looks like. And if we compare that to the Google version, I'd say that's almost identical. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back in an hour, and if I can remember it and write it normally within an hour, then the method is successful and I'll probably integrate it into my learning. Okay, so this is me 1 hour later from when I first started trying to remember the word. I'm going to record it now and try and write down the kanji and then compare it and see how well I do. So I believe the word is shimekiri, and it means deadline. And the kanji, okay, that's my attempt. I'm pretty sure that's right. Okay, so the bottom one is what it actually is compared to mine, and to be honest, I don't think I did too much of a bad job. I mean, I successfully remembered the pronunciation of the word. The kanji, I was pretty much there, apart from maybe a few strokes. So the fact that I was able to remember this word after an hour, yeah, I think that it's an effective, that Pimsla's program is an effective one, and I think from now on I'm going to start integrating this into my learning. Days 127 to 139. Again, it was back to general study, learning and attempting to incorporate new grammar devices into Japanese speaking, as well as now using the Pimsla method of vocabulary retention. On day 140, the 6th video was recorded. 今日は10時に起きました。朝ごはんは白いのパンを食べました。美味しかった。毎日は白いパンを食べられました。その後、私は歴史を勉強しました。楽しくなかった。私は歴史が好きですか？でも、書くのは長いです。 水曜日学校に行きます。待ちきれません。家で勉強するが嫌いなので待ちきれません。友達に会いてスーツを着たい。バスで学校に行く。それから歩きます。学校に行く途中、音楽を聴いたり、人を話したります。By day 140, the Pimsleur method had clearly shown some effect. In my writing, I'd used 11 more kanji than in the previous test, and used vocabulary in various topics such as food, school, and travel. Furthermore, it seemed as though I was making fewer grammar mistakes, and was showing more confidence in my speaking. Although I had shifted my oral focus away from grammar, it seemed to be coming through almost subconsciously. Perhaps, like the argument suggests, adolescents are generally better in grammar due to making use of the grammar knowledge of their native tongue. On day 144, I learnt the phrases no yo ni and no yo na, which allowed me to make comparisons between objects or between objects and adjectives. The use of no yo ni particularly enhanced my ability to retell. An example sentence could be その人は建物のように背が高い, which means that person is tall like a building. I recorded my 7th video on day 154. 今週、私は学校に戻りました。今、早いに起きにくいです。友達を見てので楽しかった。何も変わったないので幸せですか？教室で勉強良かったです。私たちは COVID テストをもらいました。少し痛いので嫌い。私は週に2回テストをします。今、大丈夫です。私はスケートをしてました。とても楽しい。しかし、僕はそれが下手です。いつか好きにしたい? To my surprise, the 6th week of testing showed a decline in my progress. While I was still relatively comfortable communicating ideas, my level of vocabulary had decreased drastically, as I'd used 19 fewer kanji as compared to my last test. Now, this may have just been an anomaly, but there is the possibility that my attitude may have affected my performance. Mark Manson says that motivation is a tricky thing. You can try to learn something difficult for a short period of time, but in the long run, you need to be reaping some practical benefit from your efforts. Without that, you'll eventually burn out. In my case, I was yielding little practical benefit. I was not engaging in any spoken conversation, and was struggling to understand the high-level Japanese of the songs and anime I was exposing myself to. This may have caused a dip in my attitude towards learning, and thus my progress may have been stunted. By day 156, I had completed all the required grammar of both textbooks. I now had the remaining 24 days to revise both grammar and vocabulary and practice speaking as much as possible to prepare for my final conversation on day 180. I recorded one last practice video on day 168. これは日本語を学ぶのに半年です。毎日練習すれば大丈夫ですよ。漢字がたくさん難しいですが、これを読みたい。私の脳は私に思い出させません。私はアインシュタインのように明るいはありません。日本の音楽を聴く間、日本語を勉強しています。話すのに役立ちます。ドロロというアニメが見ています。たくさんいいですね。人が話せないので面白いです。私はそれを見てよかったです。勉強するときは、勉強するときは、文法のない単語です。The 7th week of testing showed an improvement, using a total of 36 unique kanji in my writing, which may have meant that the results of my last test may have been an anomaly. Yet, the pause I take to think of what to say at the end still shows that my speaking was not completely up to scratch. Within the next 12 days, I had one last chance to polish up my grammar. before having my first ever conversation with a Japanese speaker. My language partner was my brother, who speaks Japanese himself, yet I had not had the chance to engage in previous conversation due to distance between living and the coronavirus pandemic. On day 180, all my skills I had learned and developed up until now were put to the test.
こんにちは。
こんにちは。
元気ですか？
元気です。
じゃあ、最初の問題で始まりましょう。暇な時に何をしますか？
私はよく勉強しますか？週末は友達に会いたり、ギターを弾いたりするのが好きです。
そうですか。で、何の科目を勉強していますか？
数学と物理と歴史を勉強してます。
なるほど。数学と物理と歴史の中で何の科目が一番いいですか？
絶対に物理の方がいいです。
それと、なぜ物理はお気に入りの科目ですか？
最初に楽しいです。難しくても勉強するのが好きです。いつか技師になりたいです。
偉いですね。じゃあ、大学に行くつもりですか？
はい、大学に行こうと思っています。
どのぐらいの頻度で勉強しますか？
もう一回？
すみません。どのぐらいの頻度で勉強しますか？
私は毎日2時間を勉強します。時々先生は私に宿題をさせてくれます。だから私は長く勉強します。
日本語の勉強は今までどうでしたか？
楽しかったですか？大変でした。ひらがなも読まなかった時のことを覚えています。
最も難しい部分は何でしたか？
それじゃあ、書くはことを私は解いて最悪でした。漢字たくさんは読めます。でも書けません。
そして最も簡単な部分は？
簡単
な部分は？
はい。絶対に、消えてでした。一日中アニメを見ました。
次は何ですか？
終わりがありません。日本語が上手、になるまで勉強をやめません。
じゃあ、ここまで終わります。
はい。
Now it's time to finally evaluate my progress. Just to recall, I was evaluating if I learned as much Japanese as I could have in 6 months, achieved a spoken vocabulary of 1,500 words, achieved a conversational level of fluency, and successfully held a conversation in Japanese. Here is what my language partner had to say on how successful my conversation was.
Well, your listening was excellent. You successfully translated and understood all of the questions. Your speaking was decent apart from some grammatical errors and perhaps a limited vocabulary, but the general messages were well received. I would suggest not speaking so fast in the future so that you can properly pronounce words and give yourself more time to think. As to whether you achieved fluency in 6 months would be a bold statement, I would say. You managed to hold a conversation, yet it only focused mainly on a single topic about school life. If you do not have a similar level of vocabulary for other topics, then it will be difficult to say you achieved fluency.
So the most successful part of the conversation was my understanding of the questions. Despite a few errors and a potential lack of vocabulary, what was being spoken by me was acknowledged by the questioner. Therefore, as there was a mutual understanding of Japanese by both the questioner and speaker, I successfully held a conversation in Japanese. Yet vocabulary seemed to be an issue. It was true that the vocabulary used in the conversation was almost entirely set around school life and studying, which did not give me much opportunity to use vocabulary from other topics, so it's hard to say whether I achieved a spoken vocabulary of 1,500 words from the conversation. Yet I did, however, do a final flashcards test on all the vocabulary I'd come across, on which I was only able to recall 865 terms out of 1,621, which is only 58% of my vocabulary goal. While retelling may have been a successful method in improving grammar, the vocabulary I was using was somewhat limited to my surroundings. Pimsleur's method may have been successful in retaining vocabulary, but as I had begun to adapt it rather late into the project, I was not able to recall as many words as I would have liked to in the time I had left. Thus, I did not end up achieving a spoken vocabulary of 1,500 words. So what does this mean for my level of fluency? Since I didn't achieve 1,500 words, I can't be considered conversational in neither Gibbons's nor Hoyt's view. Yes, I successfully held a conversation, but as stated, it was limited to only a few topics. Yet I made sure to focus on the most frequented vocabulary and have successfully recorded over 50% of it, so it'd be unfair to say that I would be completely incompetent in conversations about other topics. Furthermore, by completing the Genki textbooks 1 and 2, I've acquired sufficient grammar for an elementary level of Japanese, and have been successful in using it throughout the process of retelling. Therefore, I've achieved the conversational level of fluency to a very minimal extent. And now the final point. Did I really learn as much Japanese as I possibly could have? There are many factors to consider. The first is time. I had 6 months to learn a language, but only so many hours per day. I was only able to study for around 1 to 2 hours per day. Since I'm a student, I have 3 other subjects in which I also must devote my time to, which didn't leave a lot of time for Japanese practice. Mark Manson suggests that intensity of study trumps length of study. Due to the lack of time I had each day, I wasn't able to increase the intensity of each study session. If I had more time per day, perhaps I could have achieved an acquisition that was closer to fluency. The second factor is the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. As previously stated, the pandemic restricted me from being able to go out and practice Japanese speaking, whether it was going to a Japanese restaurant or attending a class. Essentially, I was restricted from contact with native speakers, which according to Long's original theory is a necessary condition for second language acquisition. Yet I still managed to hold a conversation in Japanese. This is partly due to the aid of the unlimited Japanese media on the internet. Long's theory was first proposed in 1981, several years before the creation of the internet, so it doesn't have as much credibility today. Instead, Ellis's revised version of the hypothesis is more suited to the 21st century, and states that comprehensible input facilitates SLA, but is neither necessary nor sufficient. So the pandemic may have made my acquisition a little harder by denying contact with native speakers, but didn't stop me from learning the language, as I was still able to hold a conversation in Japanese by the end of 6 months, without any prior native contact. The third and final factor is age. Arguably one of the biggest factors for successful language acquisition is age. Children, no matter their maturation stage, can acquire languages perfectly due to what is known as the critical period hypothesis, which ties into Chomsky's theory of innateness, as well as Piaget's theory of cognitive development. The theory is summarized by Scoville in 1988. In brief, the critical period hypothesis is the notion that language is the best learned during the early years of childhood, and after that of about a dozen years of life, everyone faces certain constraints in the ability to pick up a new language. During this critical period, children make use of what Chomsky refers to as universal grammar, which is essentially the fundamental organizing principles of grammar innately born within humans. As the critical period ends after about a dozen years of life, the theory suggests that in general, adults and adolescents will have a harder time learning a language. However, there is still the argument as to who is more efficient in language acquisition between younger or older learners. Rod Ellis suggests that adolescents learn faster than the children in terms of vocabulary and grammar, and research conducted by Snow and Hofnagelhol shows that in the classroom, adolescents are best in both syntax and morphology. And this is linked to the fact that older learners will make use of their first language learning strategies to achieve good performance in second language acquisition. And the efficiency of my learning is proven throughout this project. Though my speaking and vocabulary may have been weak in some places, and had seen an uneven increase in progress, my grammar had always seen constant improvement after each video. And studies even show that it takes around 5 years for a child to reach a vocabulary of 2,000 words and a similar grammatical ability to an adult. I had only 6 months and had acquired close to half of that number, as well as an elementary level of grammar. In fact, children only begin to exhibit first words at around 10 or 12 months. By relying on the workings of English, I was able to increase the speed of my language acquisition, so to an extent, my age helped me to learn as much as possible in the short term of 6 months. So, to evaluate, taking into account the time, impact of the coronavirus pandemic, and my age, I did in fact learn as much Japanese as possible. Though my time was limited, my age helped me to make use of my native language in order to learn Japanese quickly, and the coronavirus pandemic had little effect due to the infinite online resources. To conclude, I taught myself enough Japanese to be able to at least hold a conversation in a specific topic. I did not achieve enough vocabulary to be considered conversational, but had acquired an elementary level of grammar and a substantial amount of remembered words. Attempting to teach myself a foreign language was an incredibly difficult but rewarding journey. I was able to immerse myself into a completely different culture, and all from the comfort of my own home. I do not intend to stop learning Japanese, and may even go on to learn other languages in the future. I fully encourage anyone to take up a foreign language in their life if they have not done so already. Thank you for watching.